So, this is an interesting story. Throughout the history of the world, weddings between powerful families have always had an impact on each other's countries, have led to things that they didn't ever expect to happen, changes of borders, boundaries, wealth, intrigue, wars, all kinds of things have happened as a result of marriages. But a wedding took place in England in 1662 that had an impact that was almost unimaginable at the time on many, many levels, financial, militarily, and actually changed the course of history in England. And it's a really fascinating story. It's a love story of a type, and I think it's pretty enjoyable. All right, and we're gonna get around a lot of the circles around the British East India Company, which was incorporated by royal charter on December 31st, 1600. By Queen Elizabeth I. It went on, it was created as sort of a part trade organization, part nation state, and it reaped enormous profits eventually from around the world by dealing in India, China, Persia, Indonesia, any place a ship could go, they were there, in Asia in particular. And it went on for almost 2 centuries. All right, and it was by far, at the time, and probably to this day, the largest corporation that ever existed. I can't think of one that's bigger, but it's an interesting story, but it all starts with Charles I. All right, and Charles I was the King of England, who was executed by Cromwell. He wasn't a particularly great leader. He was pretty controversial. He was always interfering with Parliament. And at that time, there was a mood towards a more democratization, sort of, and Cromwell and his gang were sort of at the forefront of that. And I won't go through the whole history. It's a long, messy history. But in the end, Cromwell's people, Oliver Cromwell and his people, demanded that the King of England be executed. They were going to cut his head off. And they signed the warrant to kill him, and they did. And then they took over the country. And during this process, his son, Charles II, was sort of forced out of the country with his mother to go to Europe for their own safety. They had no money, and he just became sort of a king in exile. All right. The interesting thing is that Charles I was never supposed to be the King of England at all. His older brother, Henry Frederick, was the Prince of Wales, the heir apparent. But he died when he was 18 years old due to typhoid fever. So the opportunity to become king was passed down to Charles II. And when his father died in 1625, Charles I became king, and then when Charles I was executed, Charles II became king, but he didn't have a country because his father was executed and basically run out of town. And that was a big problem. And the other problem for Charles I was that he married a Catholic. And he married a French Catholic. She was a princess, and the Protestants and the Puritans and so forth took great offense at that. They thought it was just horrible because there was this whole paranoia about Rome and about French Catholics and all that sort of thing. So when they decided to kill him, it sort of became an easier choice to make because the Puritans thought this is the will of God, that they're going to execute this guy, and it was terrible. But at any rate, Prince Charles and his mother went to Europe, and they basically bummed around. They didn't have any place. They had some still people that were loyal to the king that would help them a little bit, and they would find places to stay. But other European royals really didn't want anything to do with them because Prince Charles, he was Prince Charles at the time, Charles II, was a king without a country. He had no money, he had no prospects, and at the time when he was over there, they didn't think he would ever go back to power. They were thought, this is it, he's done. And who wants to marry this ne'er-do-well when there were so many other good choices over there for prospects to marry the members of royal families, marry their daughters, and so forth. So it was a rough thing. And then in the meantime, England went into what was known as the Cromwell era, which was bloody, awful, depressing. Cromwell abolished all kinds of pleasures. Card playing was illegal. Dancing was illegal. Happy music was illegal. They went through and stripped out artwork from the churches, got rid of anything that was beautiful or lovely. Beautiful textiles were destroyed because all of this was considered to be a diversion away from God. And the Puritans wanted to bring everybody back to God. And then Cromwell was appointed, this is where things really went bad. He was appointed to go into Ireland because there was always contention between Ireland, the Irish Parliament, and the King, now the Irish Parliament and the Brits. And basically, the Cromwell crew, the Puritans, abolished Catholicism. They were just going to say there can't be any more Catholics. They went up, they took over the Irish Parliament. They kicked all of the Catholics out of the Parliament and replaced them all with Protestants and Puritans, basically. And then they went around quelling any sort of unrest that happened. And you have to remember, Charles I, Charles II, they were Anglican. They had a more nuanced approach towards Catholics. Obviously, he married a Catholic. Charles I did. They had a more nuanced approach about religion, and were sort of on that score, they were more interested in trying to find ways to work together. Charles I didn't want to remove. There were some powerful Irish Catholics that owned land, had money, wealth, power, and he wanted to bring them into his circle, into his sphere, more than Cromwell. Cromwell wanted them gone, wanted them killed, if it was necessary, and a lot of this also was done by Cromwell. It was in retribution to the revolt of 1641. And many historians said that revolt back then was remembered by Cromwell, and he used it as a way to inflict horrors on the Irish Catholics. It was very, very bad, and because they were so intolerant. All right, and hundreds of thousands of Irish Catholics were forced off their land. There were about 1.4 million Irish Catholics there. And they estimate that between 200,000 and 600,000 of them were either murdered or starved to death during Cromwell's reign, which is, so it's about a third of the, a quarter to a third of the population basically was killed by Cromwell. A lot of Catholics were and people don't know this. This is, one of the reasons why the English and the Catholics, Irish Catholics, there was a problem for a long time, right up until not too long ago. And this didn't help any because the Irish Catholics never forgot Cromwell for this. They took Irish Catholics and forced them to come to the Americas, for example, to the colonies to live. They shipped some of them to the Caribbean to work as servants. Anything to get them out of the way, because the Puritans and the Protestant overlords wanted the land, they wanted the assets, and they would give away the land that had belonged to former Irish families, give them to the Protestants, give them to the Puritans if they'd be willing to move there. So they did. There was a migration up into Ireland, and this went on for a very, very long time, and was known as it was really the peak of it was called the Cromwellian War of Ireland. It started around 1649 and ended around 1653, and it was just a bloodbath all the time. They executed people. There were stories about, killing, they killed 2,700 royalists and many civilians, and that included women and children were just plain out slaughtered. All right, and eventually the Irish were forced to surrender, and the practice of Catholicism was fully banned in Ireland, and all the Irish Catholics were kicked off their land. Thousands of them migrated to other places. It was a damn mess. And the Cromwell gang was in charge in England, and in 1653, because Cromwell had been such a strong leader in their view, they wanted to promote him to running the country. And at one point they talked about making him king, but because Cromwell had campaigned so hard to abolish the king and have a democracy, some sort of democracy, he couldn't accept being king, though many believed he really wanted to be the king. That was really the whole point of it. And instead they called him the Lord Protector. And he was the Lord Protector there from 1653 until 1658, for about 5 years. He died at Whitehall on September 3rd. All right, and then his son Richard came into power, and was basically thrown out after a year or so by the government. He was very ineffective. He was a feckless moron, more or less. Is the way it goes. And he was out, and they decided to bring Charles II back. And they reached out to him and asked Charles II if he would return, and he would. And that was it. And he came back, and he was enthroned in England around 1660. And there he was. Now the problem was that Charles II was in charge of England. The country had no money, had no prospects. It was bleak, dreary, depressing. The British East India Company was not what it was intended to be. It was sort of stripped down to its bare bones because Cromwell was a terrible businessman. Not only was he was a brutal murderer and a killer, but he was also a terrible businessman. He didn't put anything into trade. He never gave it a lot of serious thought because he was a religious fanatic, and religious fanatics tend to only think about religion, and usually everything else can go to hell in a handbasket. So, at any rate, Charles II got sworn back in. He's brought back and enthroned as emperor. And the first thing he did was he ordered that Cromwell's body be exhumed from his grave and hung posthumously. In other words, he was already dead, but Charles II wanted to make a point, and he hung Cromwell in Westminster Abbey for everybody to see. He basically saying, the bad days are over. This is the end. We're going to have to do something better than this. And then after hanging him for a while, they decapitated the corpse. And they put the head on top of a pike in Westminster Abbey for everybody to see if they wanted to see it, because the body was deteriorating rapidly, as you might imagine. He'd been already dead for a few years, and they're hanging him. And the head sat on that pike for 28 years until it was disappeared, and they think it was stolen by a Cromwell loyalist. But that was the end of Cromwell, and this was the beginning of Charles II's reign. And Cromwell was a controversial figure. And in the reading for this, doing this video, I read a lot about him. I tried to keep a fair view. And while Charles I wasn't a particularly great guy, Cromwell was much worse. He was a murderer. He was a sociopathic religious fanatic. And over in other parts of the world, they had the view that the Puritans were these kindly, nice people. They weren't. Puritans were, if they were anything like Cromwell, they were a nasty bunch of people who were hateful. And if you didn't agree with them, you were probably going to get killed for it or lose everything you own. At any rate, Charles II was coronated on April 23rd, 1661. And England was in effect broke. England was so broke at the time that when they coronated him, they had to find something to wear for the coronation, and they didn't have anything good looking. Because he returned from his wanderings in Europe, basically dressed in rags. I mean, truly rags, according to Samuel Pepys, the diarist. And they had to take drapes off the wall. One story is they took the velvet drapes they found in a room somewhere in Westminster Abbey that had escaped Cromwell, and they draped Charles II in those so he would at least look kingly when he walked into the chapel. All right, and those were dark days. Overall, for England, their economy was in tatters. Everything beautiful was gone. Food was an issue. There were all kinds of problems. All right, so the first thing that Charles needed when he got into power was he needed money. He desperately needed cash. He'd been sent some cash prior to returning to England, but it wasn't enough, and he needed cash, and he needed a wife. Because back then, if you were the king of England or the king of any country, you had to have a full monarchy required a king and a wife, a king and a queen, basically. All right, so the quest was on to find a suitable queen. And now the problem was that Charles II in his exile had met all these people, met lots of women, met lots of other royals, and he remembered how they treated him. They treated him awfully. They treated him like he wasn't anybody. That really affected him. And when he returned to England, he couldn't forget how everybody spurned him, and he didn't want anything to do with any of them, but he still needed a wife. Meanwhile, in Portugal, the 8th Duke of Braganza, who's now King John IV of Portugal, and his wife, Queen Louisa, they were seeking a husband for their daughter. And her name was Catherine. She was the eldest child. They would call the eldest child the Infanta, the eldest child of a royal family of Braganza, Catherine of Braganza. And she knew about Charles II because many years earlier, there's a lot of history here, I realize, but many years earlier, when Charles I was king, Charles II's father, before he died, obviously. He recognized the 8th Duke of Braganza, King John IV, as the legitimate king to Portugal when it won its independence back in the 1630s. He became the king, and a lot of royal families in Europe would refuse to recognize Portugal's independence from Spain. They just wouldn't recognize it. They didn't recognize King John as a royal anything, and it was a sort of horrible royal snobbery that goes on to this day to some degree, and that's what was happening. And Charles I said, no, he's the king. He's the leader of that country. And the King of Portugal and his wife then tried to arrange a marriage, a prearranged marriage for their daughter, then 6, Catherine, and Charles II. They wouldn't get married right away. It would be years ahead, but it would be an arranged marriage set in stone now. And they actually sent a picture they got a picture, a small portrait of Charles II to show to their daughter, Catherine. She was 7 years old. And she looked at it and she thought he's a handsome man and all that. And Charles II was a teenager. But anyway, that had a huge lasting impact on her. And she actually the stories are that she fell in love with him at that point. She decided, this is the guy I want to marry. But she was raised in an extremely sheltered environment, more so than most royals. One report said that in 10 years she only left the palace 5 or 6 times. She never left the palace. The palace was enormous, of course, and everything she needed was inside the palace. They had courtyards and gardens and all this, the palace grounds and all this. And the only people she saw were her teachers, a few priests, some clerics, nuns, and her parents and aunts and cousins, that kind of thing. That was her entire world, was right there. And but she had this portrait of Charles II, and when the topic came up with her parents saying, she was 24 years old by the time Charles II was sworn in, would you be or made king? Would you be interested in marrying him? And she jumped at the chance. She absolutely wanted to. And the King of Portugal and the Queen of Portugal were two very wise people. And the Queen of Portugal was a real negotiator. And they wanted to be able to get Charles II's attention. And Louisa was keenly aware that the UK was in terrible financial condition. Meanwhile, Portugal was loaded. They had piles of money. They'd been trading on a global basis for 100 years. They had palaces. They had all kinds of beautiful things, lots of jewelry, lots of money. They were a very, very powerful little country, unbelievably powerful. So they decided to sort of bait a matrimonial hook for Charles II by offering him an enormous dowry. And it was, when it was presented, the largest dowry by double of any in European history. It was a massive dowry, and included in it was 500,000 pounds of cash. Now, this was in 1661 when they made the pitch. 1661, which was an unimaginable amount of money. And some gifts, jewelry, all the usual stuff. But also trading rights, because Portugal held enormous trading rights around the world, in particular in Brazil and in India and in the East. And they threw into the deal, we'll give you 500,000 pounds if you marry our daughter. We'll give you all these trading rights, some jewelry, this and that. And Charles II was really only interested in the money. He wasn't that bright. He was a kind guy, sort of. He ended up being a bit of a philanderer. But he had never done anything. He had never managed money. He had never been king. He had never done anything. He was 30 years old. And all he knew was that he was broke and he had no money. So he jumped at the chance because he was going to get 500,000 pounds out of the deal, which he took. All right. And that was it. What was interesting was that they never told Charles that she didn't speak any English. She spoke not a word of English. I guess she spoke French and things like that, but she didn't speak any English. But he jumped at the chance. And they agreed to go through with the marriage. There was some negotiations back and forth that stalled things a little bit because Louisa was unable to come up with all the cash right away. So they enhanced it by sending in other things of high value, gold, jewelry, and that kind of thing. And they eventually got the amount up there, but it took a little time. All right. So, at any rate, when she got to England, she was viewed by the ladies of England sort of down their noses at her. They thought she was an outsider. She dressed funny. She wore farthingales, which had gone out of fashion in England some years before, but were still being worn in Europe. Those were those hoop skirts that formed the shape of the dress that are so elegant. And they thought that she was just sort of a rube dressing like that. And she was extremely reserved, Catherine. She had a language barrier. She couldn't talk to anybody, really. She had an entourage of women that came with her who spoke Portuguese. A couple of them, I guess, spoke English. But eventually Charles got rid of them because he thought they were unsightly for some reason, and he didn't like the way they looked. So he ordered them out of the country and very nicely sent them back to Portugal, where they came from, and said thank you. And Charles was openly smitten with her after meeting her, and there were stories written by people of the day, Samuel Pepys and so forth, and they'd write about how he'd ride around in the carriage and he would hold her hand and was very openly affectionate to her. And he was the king after all, so he could do whatever he wanted. And the people who were sort of resistive to her eventually fell in line. With the expectation that they would be kind to her and be a nice person. The problem, nice to the person, but the problem was that also Catherine had been raised in this very sheltered environment, and suddenly she's in England, which is a very different culture. Political at the time, political families, the king, the royals, and all that were sort of open fodder for gossip and criticism, and it was a much more raucous a social environment that she was used to. Because in Portugal, everything was very quiet, very conservative. She didn't go out of the palace a lot. Nobody ever spoke bad of her or gossiped about her because it was considered to be such an enormous impropriety. But in England, it was part of the deal. That's how they did it back then. We've all seen the British political cartoons and things going back, centuries. They've had them. At any rate, it took her a while, and after a year or two, she began to sort of get in the swing of it. She made some friends. And it started largely because the women that were tied to the court were looking at how she dressed. She had beautiful clothing, beautiful jewelry, beautiful hair pieces, perfumes. She had exotic spices and things that she ate. She liked exotic foods. And all of this became sort of interesting to them because they'd been living under Cromwell, remember, where everything was bleak, boring, dull, and dangerous. And she adjusted. She learned to speak a bit of English. And then after a couple of years, Samuel Pepys wrote, she soon grew brisk, debonair, and learned to play like other ladies, and is quite a woman from what she was. In other words, it was recognized that she was really working to try to adopt to her new land, to be a good queen, and so forth, without violating her own standards. She was quite an elegant lady, and she became sort of people began to follow what she was dressing and wearing, especially the ladies, because she sort of became a fashionista of theirs. She dressed differently. She began to decorate the palace differently, and it was all about taste and elegance and so forth. Artisans came from Portugal and began building chairs, restoration chairs. Some of them were known as these very elegant carved chairs with spiral twist legs and beautiful carving, not those ugly sausage-turned monstrosities that were big in were known as Cromwell chairs. They were terrible. These were elegant, they were light and so forth, and lots of other things came along. And this was the beginning of the big upturn. And the other thing was that Charles also wanted to live well. He had lived in poverty. He had been, he'd lived well as a very young child when his father was the king. But when he went to Europe, he was down and out. He had no money. He was broke. They relied on charity to get by. He wanted to have nice clothes. He wanted his palace to look like a palace. He wanted beautiful furniture, beautiful jewelry for his wife. He wanted all the things that go along with being a king. And the British people wanted that too. They wanted to have these luxury goods coming back into the country. They wanted to have a good life. They want to forget Cromwell ever existed. They want to get back to living. And that brings us back to the East India Company, or also known as the EIC. By 1662, when Charles II got married to Catherine, the EIC was basically a company in name only. It had no money. They hadn't done much trade in a long time. And they had very little places to trade. They had a couple of outposts left, and the money wasn't coming in. There was just no currency. And what was supposed to be a very powerful trading organization had basically lost its way. It was in a lot of trouble. And in 1668, after a few years being married to Catherine, he decided to turn over his trading rights from his marriage to the EIC and to see what they could make of it, because he wasn't a businessman. He didn't really understand a lot of this stuff, but he figured that the businessmen at the EIC could do it. It's chartered by the crown. They could take over these trading routes, take advantage of them, and as they said, see what they could make of it. So, and the British East India Company was thrilled to do it. Okay, it gave them the ability to get lines of credit. They were able to put ships out again, and this was the very beginning of the turnaround in trade for England that would turn the EIC into the largest company the world, I think, probably the world had ever seen. Just absolutely enormous, never seen to this day. So many of the things now open to the EIC to trade with are things that were common items to Catherine. Because of her life in Portugal, they had fine palimpors, pearls, calicos, rugs, silks, Japanese and Chinese lacquer, caning for chairs, and of course spices. Lots of spices and herbs that were essential for food preparation. Tea was just starting as a thing there. Furniture styles that they were seeing in Europe that they had never seen in England. All of this came about. Now, tea, interestingly, had only been introduced to England around 1660. Had been drunk in Europe before that, but it really only came in around 1660 in England. And they viewed it as sort of this weird drink. It wasn't instantly accepted. People thought it tasted funny. And it was sold basically as a medicine, and it had a very very limited market. Catherine of Braganza, however, or Queen Catherine, she was used to tea. She loved tea, and she pushed people to drink it. She liked to share it, and so forth. And this was all the starting point of when things really turned around for the Brits. Also, luckily for the English, when they went to India, when the British East India Company turned up in India, the Portuguese never told them that we've given away your trading rights. Well, we're no longer trading here. This has been a wedding gift to our daughter, who's married now to the King of England. They never told them that. So when the British showed up to begin trade, the Portuguese emissary there refused to leave. He didn't believe it. He thought they were trying to trick him, and so forth. But when they got in there, they approached the Indian government, explained the change in the situation, that they were going to be trading in India now. And fortunately for them, many years earlier, an EIC doctor back earlier in the 1600s had been in Surat, and the life of the daughter of the Shah Jahan was in jeopardy. She was sick. And he's the guy that built the Taj Mahal for his wife, if many of you remember that. But anyway, his daughter was very sick. And this East India Company doctor saved her life somehow. They don't really say what happened, but he saved her life. And because of that, the current rules of India said, you people were a friend of our country. We're going to give you a place to trade to start you out. And it was at the mouth of the Ganges River. And it was built into the largest trading port in Asia by far at the time. It actually grew to the size of almost England or London as far as trade goes, and that was Calcutta. And it all was based in Calcutta. Everything started there. The cotton trade, the spice trade, eventually, into Bombay, the opium trade developed. But they started in Calcutta, and they began bringing back all kinds of things from there for the British market and trading around the world as they went. They couldn't get into Japan. They could trade with Chinese goods if they could get access, but they couldn't get into Japan because the Japanese government had kicked Portugal out of their country in 1638 for meddling in their affairs. It's sort of a famous story, and they were banned from the country. And when the British showed up, they said, well, we're the Brits. And the Japanese said, yeah, but your king is married to the daughter of the King of Portugal. So you can't come in here and do any business. So from then on, they had to use intermediaries and buy and sell and trade through the Dutch and that kind of thing. But they managed to get it done. But they couldn't have direct access, all right? And you got to keep in mind that by the 1700s, this company became so big. It had the EIC grew to such enormous size. They had 260,000 soldiers. It was twice the size of the British Army, and they had unlimited wealth, unlimited power, and unlimited control of large pieces of the planet Earth. And it was finally dissolved in 1874, but they had quite a run. All right, so the first things that were exported out of India into England were really cottons. That was the first big export product before other things. Spices and teas and that sort of thing were coming, and they were being traded. But the beautiful textiles of Palampurs made in Mesopotamia were in enormous demand by the English. They loved them. They were beautiful. They were brightly colored, exotic, very festive and enjoyable, and people wanted them. All right. And the other thing was that English cotton was very inferior, and the cotton that was available in England at the time was very inferior to the cotton of India. India made this. They had enormous cotton plants. They had beautiful cotton. It was very durable, dyed easily. It could be decorated nicely and easily, and had everything going for it. So the EIC began placing huge orders for cotton, thousands and thousands of them. In 1681, they placed an order for 200,000 Palampurs. That kind of thing went on. And it really cut into, of course, the textile trade of domestic British companies like the wool industry. It hurt them badly. By 1685, they'd so heavily, just in 20 years, they'd taken such a bite out of the wool industry and their trade that they petitioned Parliament to do something to stop the importation of cotton. And what they ended up doing was they passed a law that said if you die, you have to be buried in wool. And that seemed to satisfy the wool merchants for the time being. Eventually, they got cotton banned from coming into England around 1700, but there was a brisk trade before that, brought in a lot of money. To satisfy the demand for this style that was popularized by the Palampurs, the tree of life patterns and all this, the wool industry began creating crewel work out of wool that emulated those popular textiles, and they found a market for them, and they did pretty well. But a lot of other things were imported. There were a lot of other products that became of interest in Europe, and that were popular in Europe, that became popular in England. And one of them was lacquer. And it started with things like this. And we'll get to porcelain and other things shortly, but it wasn't just about porcelain. It was about many other things that built this wealth. And one of them was lacquer. A strange thing. Lacquer was a mystical material. The British had never seen anything like it, and they discovered it in the Coromandel coast. They were buying lacquered cabinets that were made in China and in Japan. And the history of lacquer is a little bit confusing because as it was generally named when it reached England after the port from which it was shipped. So if it was a screen that was made in China but was shipped out of India, out of Coromandel, for example, they called them Coromandel screens. They were named after the port of departure, not by the proper name of where the item was coming from, whether it was Chinese lacquer or Japanese lacquer. The other thing that was in favor, too, were massive cabinets. Big pieces of furniture, show-off pieces of furniture. In Europe, it was very fashionable to have large walnut cabinets, very elaborately carved and decorated, beautifully worked, with all kinds of embellishments on them. And they discovered lacquer cabinets, both made in China and Japan. They were very enormous, very big pieces of wood. They were enormous. But they were considered to be just the apex of taste and elegance, and they were very exotic. And this was the thing that really drove the market. The problem was that the cabinets took up a lot of space on the ships. How many cabinets can you ship? So they had to find a workaround for it, which they did eventually do. But for example, when they would bring back these like double cabinets, a cabinet on top of a cabinet, when they got to England, they would often split them up, and they'd build elaborate gilded stands for them to stand on as presentations. and they did that kind of thing. But what ended up happening was that in the Coromandel Coast, they had Chinese screens were available, big lacquered screens, 12-fold screens. They were enormous. But the beauty of them was they folded up. So they folded up basically like lumber. So they began shipping Coromandel screens to England, and the British cabinet makers would take them and make pieces of furniture out of them. They would make wainscoting out of them, and they incorporated them into their repertoire of things that they could make. And they found an immediate market for them. They did very, very well. Eventually, the British learned to make lacquer, learned how to emulate it, and you would see japanned furniture. You saw it in American furniture, you saw it in English furniture, and also red lacquer, red cinnabar. Was considered to be almost magical. They couldn't understand, how it was done, how the layering was done, how the carvings were done, and all that. And they too were, as household items, were highly cherished. They were considered to be just the one of the great exotic things. These red boxes, and the Coromandel screens that were inlaid with things. They had Chinese figural landscapes on them, and all this, and it just played into the British view of what China must have been like and what Asia must have been like. And they often didn't differentiate early on between India and China or where the stuff came from. It was always the port of departure, where it was shipped from. And this went on for quite a while. And eventually, the joiners groups, like the woolen industry in England, the joiners began to petition in the 1690s to ban the importation of these woods because they were cutting too much into their business. But lacquerware became a great point of fascination because you could, as one writer said, you could spill a drink. You could have a table of lacquer, you could spill a drink on it and didn't leave a mark, just wiped up. And that thick, black, shiny surface was just a fascinating material because they talked about how in China people painted their houses with lacquer. They painted ships with lacquer because it was so durable. They did all kinds of things with lacquer. And the English found this absolutely amazing. The other thing that became big was, believe it or not, was chair caning. The caning that goes on in the chairs, especially the restoration chairs as they were known, and later in other chairs for the seats and the backrests. It enabled the cabinet makers to make these very attractive, lightweight, but very sturdy and comfortable chairs with seat caning. And seat caning and caning in general out of India became a very, very big industry. And they began to improve the styles of English furniture. They began to improve with as I said before, with the restoration chairs, elaborate carvings, barley twist legs. They got rid of the sausage turnings that they were so popular. Cromwell chairs were ugly and uncomfortable, is what it amounts to. And to this day, those are known as Cromwell chairs. And then the restoration chairs came in after that, and it was a style of furniture that was later adopted in the Americas as well. But it began then. It began then with the Spanish feet, and these were chairs. This style of chair was known in Spain and Portugal, and they began artisans from Portugal, artisans in England began to adopt these styles into their own work, and greatly improved the visual appeal of furniture. These high back chairs were considered to be just the top of elegance as far as seating furniture went. And it went on from there right into the 18th century. And everybody wanted them. So cane also ended up being used on book holders and floor screens and other things. There was a giant amount of interest. And then, of course, porcelain. Interestingly, a lot of people might not know is that porcelain got its name from the Italian and the Portuguese word porca, which means cowrie shells, because the surface of a porcelain dish was white and hard like a cowrie shell. And cowrie shells were considered to be a very important meaning of trade for centuries. People wore them as talisman around their necks. They were very, very rare. They were valuable. And they began to call the porcelain from China porcella or porcelain. And that's where the description comes from. And early on, there wasn't much porcelain in England. There was very little porcelain in England by 1662, almost none. Charles I's father had some porcelain, and Charles remembered it, apparently, and tried to find it when he returned to the castle. But he didn't have a lot of it. He had like maybe 10 pieces of the stuff. It was gone. Cromwell, no doubt, had it destroyed and that kind of thing. But there was a sort of a little bit of interest in it, but the British East India Company was more interested in other goods at that time. They were interested in spices, they were interested in teas, they were interested in coromandels, things, cotton, all that. They were considered to be the profitable items, not porcelain. But they quickly learned that the best way to drink tea, which was starting to gain a little bit of speed, wasn't out of leather cups and wasn't out of coconut shells, which were the standard British drinking things. Sometimes a little bit of silver, not ideal for drinking hot tea because it would burn your fingers. They began to talk about these brown wares that were in China that could come out, known as yixing. And yixing was really sort of one of the first porcelains that found a big market in England, long before blue and white porcelain and enamel wares. It was yixing because the properties of yixing clay are particularly good for drinking tea. They enhance the flavor of the tea and make it much more drinkable, and they were stylish and so forth. So a lot of the early orders were for yixing teapots that came in. And these were acquired through intermediaries who were getting them out of China. And this went on for some time. And then eventually, of course, companies like Staffordshire began, by the end of the 1600s, began copying yixing with their own brown clays to go with tea. But that came later. But at any rate, this was how it went. And the English didn't really get full access into China to buy porcelain until 1699. They had some entrance, they were allowed some activity in there, but on a very limited basis to trade at Amoy and Fushan, Chusan and Canton, but it was very, very limited around 1676. It was only at certain times. It was very complicated. But by 1699, the Kangxi Emperor expanded the EIC trading rights in Canton, much to the furor of the Portuguese, because the Portuguese gave them the access, and now the EIC was outgrowing anything the Portuguese were doing, and they began placing orders for porcelain. But most of the porcelain trade, really, the development of porcelain in the British market was driven by tea. That was the real reason. After 1699, they opened it up so you could order more porcelain. Lots of tea sets were ordered, lots of cups and saucers, lots of teapots, all that sort of thing. And eventually, around then, they allowed custom orders for armorial wares. The earliest armorial wares for England were made around in the late 1600s, early 1700s. That's when it really began. And they began producing large dinner services, plates, bowls, tureens, all kinds of exotic things. And you see them sometimes. You still see these Kangxi pieces that are enameled or underglazed blue on the market, and from that period. And they were really at the very, very beginning of trade with England and their porcelain. All right, and all of this was known very well to the Catherine. She was very familiar with porcelain. She grew up with it in Portugal. Their palace was full of the stuff, but there wasn't any of it in England until a while after she'd been living there. It's interesting because the Portuguese called the name for yixing in Portugal is bocaro, and today they call him yixing. It's just a little footnote there on the naming. At any rate, it was ideal for flavoring tea, and once that started to come in and people began brewing tea, steeping the tea and yixing wares, it started to develop a lot more interest. It tasted better. People enjoyed it. The pots themselves became very stylish. And then, like I said, Staffordshire and other places began to emulate these brown wares. with the decorations. There were a few families that were particularly known for making these, and they were very successful and so forth. So by the late 17th century, the style of Chinese porcelain makers was being emulated across Europe in their own styles with faience. Okay, but faience had been around for a while before that, but then they really began copying Chinese examples, English faience, and so forth. They were copying blue and white wares and then eventually enamel wares. But it all came from the Chinese trade. Because the English and the Europeans had not learned yet how to make porcelain. They had no way of making it. And it wasn't until 1712 when the French Jesuit Pierre d'Entrecollet wrote a famous letter back to France describing from eyewitness accounts in Jingdezhen how they made porcelain, how they prepared the clay. And it was fairly detailed. It was detailed enough that the German alchemist Johann Böttger, who was the first to develop porcelain in Europe, was able to do it. He'd been working at it for a long time. He was actually sort of enslaved by Augustus the Strong of Saxony, who had become a big porcelain collector, Chinese porcelain collector, and he had Böttger, who was an alchemist. He commanded him to first he wanted him to make gold because Augustus the Strong was running out of gold, and he thought an alchemist could make gold somehow. And in the meantime, Böttger got on to learning how to make porcelain, and he finally figured it out. And this pleased Augustus the Strong greatly because Augustus the Strong was a porcelain buyer, and he was a bit of a fanatic. There's the famous story about the soldier vases when Augustus the Strong traded 600 soldiers, dragoons as they were known, mounted soldiers on horseback, for some Chinese Kangxi porcelain from Friedrich Wilhelm of the First of Prussia. He wanted his porcelain collection, in particular, some very, very large vases known now as dragoon vases or dragon vases, depending on whose book you're reading. But there were these very large blue and white jars with covers on them. And he traded 600 soldiers and their horses, apparently, for 151 pieces of porcelain, including this 9 or 10 dragoon vases. And that's how big porcelain was getting by the early 17th century in Europe. But the English were still a little bit behind the curve, but they were catching up very rapidly by the early 1700s. They were beginning to place large orders. Tea was coming into a big demand. So they were ordering lots of teapots, lots of porcelain was being developed, armorial wares were being developed, and they were vacuuming up giant amounts of porcelain. And between around 1720 and 1770 or 80, they estimate that the Brits imported around 30 to 40 million pieces of Chinese porcelain. That's millions. Okay, just they filled ships with this stuff because there was enormous demand for it. There was even enormous demand for broken pieces, which were actually advertised because lots of porcelain broke on the ships, as you might imagine. So they would place orders for them, and people would say, "Well, I'll take the broken ones so I can decorate my house with it." And it went on and on from there. So you had cotton, you had all the spices that were happening because of this marriage. You had lacquers were being imported. The taste in furniture was evolving. They wanted lacquer furniture. They wanted Chinese porcelain to go with their tea. And all of this came about because of this marriage to Charles II. It all began in 1662 and went on from there to just completely transform British culture. Because we all know by the 19th century, tea and Britain were tied inextricably. They were one and the same. The British became known for tea, and that interest in tea began at this time. All right, and unfortunately, Charles II died in 1685. And the Empress, the Queen of Portugal, ended up moving back to Portugal in 1692, roughly, and she became the Queen Regent to her brother, who was King Dom Pedro. And she died in December of 1705 at the age of 67. And interestingly, she was buried at the Tower of Belem, and it is the exact point where Vasco da Gama set sail in 1497 when he discovered the sea route around the Cape of Good Hope, into off of South Africa to get to India. That's where all of the Portuguese trade began in 1497 with his discovery. And the lasting effect on British life, you only need to look at the furniture designs of Thomas Chippendale with his ball and claw-footed chairs, tables emulating dragons with the ball and claw feet at the bottom with the pearl. That was taken from Chinese art. There was also the batwing brasses that you saw on Queen Anne furniture and later on Chippendale furniture. They're based on auspicious bats. And then there were, I think, 9 designs in Thomas Chippendale's book on chair backs that emulated lattice patterns from China, including a cracked ice pattern and that sort of thing. And then, of course, all the fretwork that you see down the legs of Chippendale chairs on cabinets, moldings, and so forth, pagoda-shaped alcoves and rooms, and the arches above doors were all based on Chinese designs right through the 17 and into the 1800s. And this same impact was happening in America with lacquer furniture, canework chairs. There's a famous chair that belonged to Penn of Pennsylvania. The state was named after him. And he had chairs brought over from England done in canework, and quickly workers here began making cane-seated chairs and restoration-style chairs and so forth. So there was the long impact is absolutely breathtaking, and it all started with that marriage. It all started there and went right through. So a lot of almost everything that the British ended up bringing in from Asia and China was a direct result of this marriage. And it never gets discussed. But that's the story. It's a little complicated, but I hope you found it interesting. And leave a comment if you like this. And thanks so much for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.